My name's Denise Cruz. I'm the chair of English and Comparative Literature. I am going to introduce our panelists and then we will get on our way. Hannah Weaver is an assistant professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia. She teaches and writes about the literature of medieval Europe, particularly the regions now known as England and France. Her articles cover everything from time and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight to the treachery of incomprehensible English to the relationship of genre to purgatory, and they've appeared or are forthcoming in ELH, New Literary History, New Medieval Literatures, JBEMS, and Viator, among other venues. Experimental Histories, Interpolation, and the Medieval British Past is her first monograph. Manan Ahmed is associate professor at Columbia University and historian of South Asia and the littoral Western Indian Ocean world from 1000 to 1800 CE. His areas of specialization include intellectual history in South and Southeast Asia, critical philosophy of history, and colonial and anti-colonial thought. He's a member of Columbia's Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race, Center for the Study of Muslim Societies, and the Committee on Global Thought. He's senior editor at Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Andy Galloway is the James John Professor of Medieval Studies at Cornell. He teaches and writes about a range of time-bound yet widely implicated features and transformations of medieval and early modern literature and culture in England, circa 800 to 1600. His areas of focus include book history, ethical norms, and literary and social expressions, the interaction between Latin culture and vernacular transformations in English and French, pre-capitalist economic modes and their literary and historiographical resonances, the reception of classical literature, and roles of women in literary, religious, and ritual contexts. Eleanor Johnson is associate professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia and specializes in late medieval poetry and prose, drama, medieval poetics and literary philosophy, law and literature in the medieval ages, and vernacular theology. She is most recently the author of Waste and the Wasters, Poetry and Ecosystemic Thought in Medieval England. Please join me first and foremost in warmly congratulating Hannah Weaver for her first book.
Can everyone hear me okay? All right, super. Thank you so much for being here. I'm delighted to see so many colleagues, friends, and students past and present. It's a real delight to see you all. And thank you to the Heyman Center for organizing this event, especially Lindsay and Sylvia for all your facilitations in this time of difficulties of getting on campus. I really appreciate it. And thank you, panelists, for engaging with this work. I appreciate your close attention, and I'm looking forward to your remarks. So let me tell you a little bit about this book. Interpolation is a practice that has a rotten reputation, even though it can be defined pretty neutrally as the insertion of material into a pre-existing text. Since the Library of Alexandria, scholars have devoted themselves to sniffing out interpolations and excising them from the so-called authentic text by marking them as spurious with little symbols, or, in our age of critical editions, sending them to the footnotes. Yet, despite long-standing worries that interpolations corrupt or harm their host texts, interpolation is everywhere in medieval manuscript culture. And though we might fancy that true accounts of real events would not be susceptible to this revisionary, even falsifying impulse, that is not at all the case. In fact, medieval historical manuscripts are rife with interpolation. This contradiction made me curious. Why would history writers repeatedly turn to a supposedly malicious practice? Was there another way to understand what interpolation could do to narratives of the past other than harm the original texts? My investigations led me to the conclusion that interpolation provided a canny strategy for historians to think about how narrative might reflect different experiences and perceptions of time. I studied three major groups of interpolation in the book, all of which intervene in the history of Britain. The interpolation of prophecy, oh, it's working, brought critical information about God's disposition of time into history, but did so in a multi-referential way that invited readers to develop their faculty of prudence. The insertion of saints' lives and romances into history installs typological patterns of precursor and fulfillment that the uninterpolated history lacks. And the interpolation of images draws attention to the syncopated rhythms of time that are best reconstructed in a viewer's mind. Images can even allow readers to brush up against the simultaneity that is a hallmark of God's time. Let me give you one concrete reading from the book. The most famous example, at least in Western medieval manuscript studies of interpolation, is in a 13th century manuscript held in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. And this manuscript has a copy of a 12th century history of Britain by a cleric called Was. Was was a scrupulous historian who recorded any doubts he had during his research. And when he got to King Arthur, he commented that he had heard tell of a bunch of adventures that had happened during his reign, but that he couldn't find any evidence, so he preferred not to recount them. I've put the passage on the slide. In most Was manuscripts, the history continues apace after this brief authorial comment. Not so in this manuscript, where an interpolator has inserted 5 lengthy Arthurian romances about said adventures, going against the author's explicit hesitations about their value. And this interpolator intervenes, that's what's in green on your slide, and says, but what Chrétien testifies you can hear now without delay. So these are the 5 surviving romances by the French poet Chrétien de Troyes. That's the Chrétien that he's mentioning here. And all of a sudden, in this rather sober history, let's face it, Was is fairly dry. We've got Lancelot rescuing Guinevere, a knight who has a lion for a companion, jousts, witches, potions, the whole 9 yards. Now, much previous scholarship about this manuscript has focused on genre. The supposed separation between fiction and history is clearly ignored by the redactor who thought adventure stories made a good historical source. The massive interpolation in this manuscript does not only help us retrospectively perceive how history and romance or medieval fiction could both be sources of information about the past for medieval audiences, however. It also transforms both the Brut, which is the history, and Chrétien's works. It creates new patterns of repetition across time that encourage readers to think about their experiences in terms of prefiguration and fulfillment. In other words, it encourages people to think about history typologically. So here's one of the interpolated romances. It's Cligès. It's the beginning of Cligès. In the Brut, which was translated from Latin in 1155, King Arthur was, you may have heard, betrayed by his steward Mordred. Around 1176, in full awareness of the widely circulating story of Mordred's treachery, Chrétien de Troyes wrote a treacherous regent into his Arthurian tale, Cligès, which is one of these 5 romances inserted into the Brut. So unlike Mordred, Chrétien's Ancresse is defeated by Arthur and his champion Alexandre, allowing him to keep his throne and continue providing for an adventure-hungry coterie of knights. This manuscript oddly integrates Chrétien's rewriting into the history that inspired it. A reader of this history sees Arthur betrayed by Chrétien's usurper Ancresse before his reign is imperiled and ultimately ended by Mordred. So, who cares? This interpolation doesn't just make the history longer or, to our eyes, more fictitious. It also creates a typological pattern, changing the time scheme of the history from something approximating that old chestnut, one damn thing after another, to one where figures and events might prefigure subsequent ones or fulfill the promise of previous ones. So in this case, Ancresse, the traitor that Chrétien invented following the pattern of Mordred, Ancresse ends up prefiguring Mordred, which is ahistorical, obviously, and Mordred realizes the impotent threat of this precursor, Ancresse. The manuscript circles around the idea of treachery. Its repetitions bring Arthur's past in contact with his present, and the new iteration produces a different outcome. Interpolation transforms Wasse's history into a text that takes historical repetition seriously as a potential source of information about divinely ordained patterns. So ultimately in this book, I argue that paying attention to interpolations in medieval histories of Britain allows two previously blurry aspects of historical culture in 12th and 13th century England and France to come into focus. The first is about the theoretical role of interpolation. The explicit commentary on the relationship between history and time that was available in the period did not suffice to capture time's complexity. Interpolation became a characteristic form of medieval histories of Britain because its interruptive force gave historians a chance to re-envision historical time and narrative. This species of narrative revision thrived in a manuscript culture that easily permitted insertions into pre-existing texts and an educational context that encouraged rhetorical amplification as a strategy of argumentation. Interpolation empowered readers and writers to think about the multifarious relationship between history and time through manipulation of pre-existing narrative frameworks. That's the first punchline. And the second discovery is about the nature of past time presented in these manuscripts. Their narrative revisions reveal that the medieval historians of Britain that I study thought that any single time scheme, teleological time, cyclical time, any single time scheme could not fully account for the movement of the past. Interpolations instead show that history was thought of as inescapably timeful, as full of times. For these medieval historians, past time was manifold and unfixed. Thank you again for coming tonight.
Yeah.
Okay. Better? Thanks, Lindsay. First of all, I've had the honor and privilege of reading this book in a few iterations, and I just want to start by saying it is so beautifully written. It's almost overwhelming. And I really, Hannah, am so in awe of your prose style and your turns of phrase and how sort of bright and engaging the whole narrative is. It's just an absolutely astonishing achievement of writing. And I love how you weave into, sorry, I keep using this metaphor of your name, but weave into your work these like sort of casual phrases that are just so powerful. Like most scholars, she says, talk about interpolation as something that corrodes textual integrity, right? Which of course is exactly what you're arguing against. You're arguing that interpolation is in fact a predicate for a certain very timeful, as you were just saying, form of textual and historical integrity. It's a way of it's a deliberately employed strategy for creating a kind of densified experience of time and narrative. And I find that totally persuasive. I also love that you describe medieval historians as highly experimental and their attempts to convert lived experience of time into narrative, right? So they're playing with these different forms, they're thinking about it, and in particular playing with interpolation. I love how you talk about the way that interpolation makes a claim about the nature of history as something, as you were saying, timeful, but also something not strictly linear, something where recovering some kind of coherent causal narrative isn't the only kind of narrative you want to be recovering. It's more recursive, it's multiplicitous, it's layered. And one of the things I wanted to respond to kind of at scale is that, you know, you talk so persuasively about how important this is to the medieval understanding of history, the medieval practice of history. But as I was reading through your work, I was so struck by how much your analysis of the Brut reminds me of 21st century American feminist poetry, in which linear history is also understood to be almost dangerous when understood as strictly linear. Feminist poetry in American 21st century is very invested in the idea that the past doesn't die. It doesn't go away. It's infinitely perforable, and that things that are happening now have often happened then, and then, and then, and then also. And we lose sight of that recursiveness only to our own peril. I was so struck by how someone like Lisa Robertson, who's a contemporary Canadian poet that many of you may or may not be familiar with, she would totally agree with everything in here. She uses kind of even different font sizes and font styles to sort of trouble the narrative structure of the page. And I was thinking about how medieval scribal culture facilitates doing that too, in the way you read the Bayeux tapestry and kind of allow all the different kind of almost fields of text of that work to kind of emerge as this fascinatingly layered simultaneity. So I was so just overpowered by how strong the resonances are between, medieval experimentation with the nature of history and with how you render history in literary form, and what I see going on now in contemporary poetic practice. The other thing that I was so struck by, which is related, is that for you, these interpolated moments, and I love the part where you talk about them as prudential, as sort of like there are these interpolated moments that have a kind of a prophetic valence to them in some of the Brut tradition writings. And the prophecies aren't always true and they aren't always false. And so Hannah's argument is that as you read through this narrative and you encounter this kind of interpolated discourse, you have to sit there and assess its truth value. You have to assess, like, what instructive meaning is there in this? How am I supposed to understand this? And so the interpolated field becomes something that trains you to be a better and more discerning reader. And that dynamic is very much in play in 21st century feminist poetry as well. The idea that the more times you encounter language that appears to be gnomic, the more almost skeptical you should be about how much truth value to assign to that thing. And I love the way that you think of interpolation, as you say, not as corrosive, but as constitutive and constructive. And I think didactic is probably not quite the right word, but as like, it's almost, these interpolations work to teach you how to read critically, not to teach you any one particular parcel of knowledge that you're supposed to take away from the text. And I thought that the way you braid all of these different ideas about time and temporality together was utterly persuasive. And it helped me zero in on something that I, as a medievalist, have noticed for many years, but have never fully had the language to give voice to, which is that time doesn't seem laminar in medieval text. It doesn't seem like it's a flow that only goes in one direction, right? It does seem like it's accretive and accumulative and layered. And you use the metaphor of a knot at one point. That really resonates for me as a way of understanding some of the like Piers Plowman, for example, some of the thornier texts that appear to my eye to be written deliberately to frustrate something like paraphrase, right? William Langland didn't write a poem hoping that we could like paraphrase back its content neatly and tidily. But to think about interpolation in that work as well was so suggestive for me, because I've always wondered, like, what is Langland doing when he repeats these Latin phrases at seemingly random accidental intervals? And as I was reading your book again, I thought to myself, oh, I shouldn't think of these as repetitions. I should think of them almost as interpolations, right? As Langland is interpolating prior moments of his own poem into itself and kind of seeding them through the work and asking us to understand anew at each novel encounter what this particular interpolation can mean, or how it can signify, or what it can do. And I guess the last thing I wanted to say is that I was so struck by kind of the lyricism of all of this, which is a strange thing, I guess, for me to think about when I think about medieval historiographical writing, because I don't personally immediately think of lyricism when I think of medieval historiographical writing. But now I feel like I'm going to have to, because there's something so playful and lyrical and kind of these captured little gem-like moments that these interpolations seem to kind of import into the otherwise, historical narrative that they're worked into. So one of the things I was hoping you'd talk to us a little bit more about afterwards is whether you think there is kind of an almost lyrical impulse behind some of these interpolations, and if there's not, what is not lyrical about it. I also was fascinated by your distinction between compilation and interpolation, and was hoping you could just say a little bit more about that distinction and really what's at stake in it. And I also hope that you could offer a few more sort of meditations for us on how this phenomenon of historiographical interpolation might change what we think we're talking about when we say words like scribe versus author, right? So where do we really want to locate authorial agency when we're looking at an interpolative field like the ones you're looking at?
Thank you. So, Eleanor, first of all, let me just congratulating the author. Yep, got it. Sorry. Can you hear me better? Yes, no, yes, okay. So let me congratulate Hannah on a beautifully written work and an achievement also of kind of a cogent, thorough argument that does not flag over the course of the monograph, which is I think a talent in and of itself. I am not of this world. This being this for the purpose of my comments being Britain. But I work on the 13th century nonetheless, or I was trained in the 13th century. So I have some tactile relationships to that temporal past. I guess there's in the beginning of the work, Hannah kind of tells us how interpolation had become a bad word in historiography, and there's a bit of kind of, I guess, reconstruction or reaffirmation of taking interpolation seriously by manuscript and book culture historians and people working on narrative. And it reminded me that interpolation has just now started to come into focus for those of us who study Arabic and Persian literary cultures. And there's two reasons. So there's the reason number one why, medievalists who work on these literary cultures have just now started looking at it is because manuscript culture has gone through successive forms of colonization and destruction. So we don't actually have a way to kind of think without, looking at later copies and later compilations and later forms of re-narrating, even massive works that are in critical editions in 40 and 50 volumes. So very recently, in about 5-6 years ago, there was a project, a digital history project out of Al Khan University called Kitab, who started to think about interpolation from basically from printed or critically edited works, basically from 9th, 10th, 11th century in Arabic and Persian. And they have started to kind of think about interpolation and identifying passages that machine learning, et cetera, allows them to do. So a bit of that infrastructure of how to think about interpolation is beginning. Much of what I say to my colleagues in that, I'm going to say now. Because I think I will speak from a distance. I think what I learned a lot from this work made me think about the genres, the textual practices, and the forms of thinking about the past that I'm much more familiar with in Arabic and Persian history, literary cultures. And the framework that I have used in my head was always, or at least anytime I had to explain it to colleagues and students, was that the narrative structure that is predominant in Arabic, Persian, and Sanskrit in the 13th century is accordion. People know what accordion is, yeah? So it's things that can kind of collapse and snap back into some kind of tighter model. And there's certain kind of ways in which that structure may be familiar. So if you read Alif Lala Walala, like 1001 Nights, you may have seen the way, usually in Western historiography, it's explained as a ring structure, but it's not really a ring structure. It's actually an accordion structure. And what the accordion structure allows is what Hannah shows us, what interpolation is doing, where it's identifying a gap within which a hole can be inserted that does different things than the manuscript was doing, the narrative was doing. In this, the historians, when they encounter in the 9th century or so a way to tell political histories, histories of place, and this is an important point, that the only perhaps point I want to make, they face a decision. So the question is, as you're giving a history of descent from Adam to the present, or a history of the formation of one political entity or another, and the genres within which much of literary culture is happening, stories, narrative, epics, romances, etc., within which this interpolation is a kind of unproblematic practice. What does the historian do in this way, which is the challenge that I think Hannah's book beautifully takes on. There are two strategies that historians take. The first, I'll describe them both, and I think they will map onto what this book argues. The first is that someone like Masudi, who's in the 9th century, what he will do is that in Muruj al-Dahab, the field of gold, is he will say, in order to understand an event, I must give you both the event and all necessary context that you as a reader may need. Now, that all necessary context as a reader gives him the narrative space in which he can plug in different things. Now, a modern reader, or at least me reading those things, I'm like, how is this literally relevant? That you know how to make, my favorite example is, how to make sandalwood soap. I still use it, so I was glad to see the recipe. The thing that he's also describing, however, is the beginning of a battle in Sindh. So, but that idea of the context allows him to interpolate different types of set pieces that continue. Does not kind of hinder him in making his claim of what that history is meant to do. The history is meant to be a place of reflection, of ethics, of political theory, all things that I think, and as text shows us, the interpolation is also doing in 13th century in Britain. Second is the second model is what Nizami would do in the late 12th century. Nizami, this is in Persian rather than Arabic, but what Nizami would do is that he would organize his accordion framework along ideas of place making. So place rather than history becomes the kind of primary task that a historian has to do. The historian has to show you how to understand a particular geography. And what that does is that when the spatial data is kind of laid out in textual form, the reader is moving spatially along different places. The best way that this is done is by taking something like the Alexandrian story, or taking some other kind of formal way in which the protagonist moves across space. I mean, the Arthurian legends are doing something similarly. In other words, what is happening in 13th century Arabic and Persian historiography is that the historians are using some versions of interpolation to tell us about space itself, place itself, the making of a region, the making of the people who are in the region. Now, this is not a huge part of the analysis that Hannah is doing here, but that was the most suggestive to me from my kind of place of alterity looking into the work that is happening. That is to say, I was really curious about how these interpolation, these particular histories are creating the idea of Britain, or there's a moment in when Roman British English is identified, this is page 51, as gaps that can be interpolated. And what I thought there was really interesting to me was that what is Roman, not just geographically, but also theoretically, and what is Britain and what is English, are the task that the text is performing rather than describing, as in this is creating that place for the reader. And this ties into the point that I will end after this, which is, what is the task that the historian is embedded in the literary cultures I'm most familiar with? The ethical project of history writing is the kind of foremost responsibility. It is both in terms of a theory of conduct and a theory of past conduct that allows us to think about future conduct. But the ethical project is also to model for the reader or the listener, as the case may be, how to do ethical reflection. So it contains within it spaces where the reading or the listening public kind of works it out as if it's a mathematical problem, right? So you kind of pause, you think, you say, action A leads here, action B leads there. Action A leads to this outcome, action B leads to that outcome. How do we kind of differentiate between the two? And the historian walks you through these choices. They do this by interpolating past events. They do this by interpolating poetry. They do this by interpolating sections from other histories that are not part of the history that are the placemaking that's happening. Then in all of them, the historian is the guide. The historian is the kind of person who's going to hold your hand and kind of walk you through these. And I thought that part was also very much in sync with what you were doing in terms of the role of the historian and the role of the kind of interpolator, author, compiler. I was also like, there are different ways in which, Hannah, you kind of narrate the agent of history writing, and I think there's some tension there in where you want to kind of put the emphasis. And so those are some really suggestive ways in which my own understanding of my field, literary cultures and historical traditions that I'm most familiar with, was actually enhanced by reading this beautifully kind of I think sensitively done work, because it allows us to, as a reader, pause, as our author here tells us to kind of slow down and to take into account what both the historians are doing in medieval Britain, but also what our author is helping us see why this interpolation is doing and how is it formally structured in the page. Those are some of my thoughts, and I thank you very much for this opportunity.
I had some slides too. These are not as fabulous as Hannah's slides at all, but they'll give you something to look at, which I think sometimes helps alleviate the tedium of listening. So again, thanks to all involved, Denise and certainly Lindsay and her staff and Hannah and the conveners of this, I think, excellent kind of format for thinking critically about a book that has just appeared by one of your own. Distended interpolations, antitypes and figures, prophecies as stitches in time. What kind of history is this? We too often approach medieval chronicles as, at best, biased witnesses to otherwise lost personalities and politics, at worst, stilted products of monks consigned to endless rounds of prayer, song, and reading God's word 10 times a day, season after season. No wonder, opined Charles Jones in 1947, that our Benedictines, when they began to write, thought of time as a daily round and ever-turning wheel, and sometimes with Satan lurking in the shadows, a grinding millstone. Curricula, curriculi, revolutiones are their constant epithets for time, Jones observed, and cursus is a synonym for opus dei. Yet published a year after Erich Auerbach's similarly war-born Mimesis, Jones's Saints' Lives and Chronicles launched the investigation of medieval history as interpolation, attending even more directly than Auerbach to Western representations of reality, in Jones's case, showing how medieval annalistic narrative emerged from the crevices of calendars of saints' feasts. We've come far since then in narratological or formalist approaches to medieval historiography, from William Brandt to Hayden White, that sometime medievalist, Nancy Partner, Gabriel Spiegel, Chris Given Wilson, Laura Ashe, Stephen Justice, and others. Despite Hayden White's further oeuvre and Frederick Jameson's observations on the flattened and commodified view of history produced by late capitalism and postmodernity, far more formalist focus has been given to medieval historical narrative than anything later. Partly that's because it's hard for us to assess their levels of belief or narrative pleasure between the true law of history and history's place under rhetoric. Mostly that's because the field is extremely rich, in which Gibbon-level projects jostle with works verging on domains we define as romance, encyclopedia, and epic poetry. Weaver offers something new in medieval historiography and formalism, a history of the historical writer as historical reader, bumped through narratives in the Brut tradition that invite further interpolations and backcurrents against linear time, all from post-conquest to early 14th century England, primarily vernacular verse histories devolving from the British history, widely accepted as that, anticipating, presenting, and following the reign of King Arthur, whose outlines sprang like Athena from the expressionless but surely wry head of the Welsh marcher Geoffrey of Monmouth, belated prophet for the post-conquest world that would soon incorporate Galfridian history everywhere. It's no criticism to say that Weaver provides tools for far wider assessments than she herself demonstrates. Her focus is on the sharpening of individual readers' responses in general, leaving to others assessments of the social and institutional agendas of these histories, by far the most common interpretive framework. She offers at once an assessment of how post-conquest culture produced newly prudent and critically textual readers and writers, and leaves provocative gaps of her own, drawing us in as her readers to ponder how and why that happens so much, and in which particular settings, with what particular social and political payoffs. Though I consider myself mostly a philologist and old historicist, I applaud the range of narrative temporality theory Weaver generates, parallels, and in part engages. I too see further relevance to feminist historiography, queer temporality, anti-chrononormativity, a range of meaning-making resistance to linear time, which, with few exceptions, have been considered only in very recent and very literary materials. In her work, the stakes are at least as high, both because the writings she probes are national origin narratives, and because she pursues these through a span that is itself often merely an interpolation, the thousand-year digression called the Middle Ages, adjacent to the march of proper intellectual, economic, literary, religious, et cetera, history, from antiquity to the Renaissance, to global modernity, to postmodernity. Weaver challenges the peripheral or spare parts status of the medieval in a shrewd and unusual way, capitalizing on the period's own anti-linearity. This turns out to be a remarkably productive focus for post-conquest English medieval historiography. Something different and important is going on in these post-conquest histories. Emphasizing modality, the textual and visual worlding via invitations for readerly alertness and participation does not mean Weaver is not being historicist, perhaps in more penetrating ways than pursuits of specific contexts, social and institutional settings, agendas, and ideologies. I, a less adroit narratologist, would probably pursue those contexts more directly, pondering how and why these were cases in which time must have a stop. The operations she investigates show new ways in which lay readers and vernacular, but usually clerical writers, and I think those should not be completely blurred categories, were, she says, engaged in meticulous alteration and inscription of the past in narrative, in other words, acting as historians, end quote. But shouldn't we go further in pursuing and refining the settings of these edgy historicizings? The meeting points of what I would expect are mostly elite lay readers and their literary chaplains. Weaver's whole book approach, treating the narratology of entire manuscripts, not just discrete works, seems to me exactly right. Shouldn't we expand the horizon further to patrons, chaplains, institutions, politics, caste identity, proto-national propaganda, seeking to understand further the particular uses of these historical and narrative interpolations, what Chaucer in the late 14th century would call in-etching? Well, one reason not to do that is the wide range of this phenomenon, as implied by my mentioned Chaucer. Another might be the central importance of the media. The manuscript-centered horizons Weaver emphasizes are where the action is, anti-chrononormatively speaking. Form has its powers, of which official powers often profess to know nothing. The typologies for Wass's presentation of Arthur, created by interpolated romances by Chrétien de Troyes in one manuscript of Wass, do not advance any unusual political agenda. Arthur alone served those well enough. Instead, these echoes add timeful echoes and gaps that Weaver shows created the conditions in which readers and scribes might add or imagine further interpolations. And here I have a slide to change to. Thank you. Situating themselves in and against the past in a transposition of examples from texts onto lived experience. If I had time, I'd note other innovations during that, doing that in this span. The historical first-person narrator or commentator, a crux between the past of narrative and the present of the writer, appears widely from the 12th century on, as if writers, battered by competing histories and historical principles, felt forced to take more obvious positional stands. Wass's personal remarks on his oral sources concerning the Norman conquest in his Roman de Rue would be relevant. So too moments in all the major Latin historians, William Malmesbury, Henry of Huntington, Matthew Paris. The mid-13th century proliferation of compilation launched by Vincent of Beauvais is an intriguing case. Vincent's 6 million words of culled past authorities stand subject to Vincent's actor, his visibly editorial MC. Vincent's preface is breathless with his temporal innovation. He's made something old in matter and authority, he says, but new in its compilation and aggregation of parts. Weaver excludes compilation on the grounds that interpolation is more carefully mortised in, not like the movable train cars of compilation. But compilatio rapidly became a major narrative function whose self-inscriptions led to wider narrative and temporal experiments in textual presence. After Vincent, think of Ranulph Higden, whom Weaver quotes, think of Chaucer, whom Weaver does not. The only emphatic exception to Weaver's reasoned and open choice not to feature particular political settings or wider cultural homologies is the Norman conquest itself, which she especially invokes as the context for the Bayeux Embroidery, Bayeux Tapestry, known to many, made soon after. That homology serves as the book's unique focus on eventfulness. That context is tangled in ongoing debate, whether the context was less widely transformative than we assume, or in contrast, profoundly, even clinically traumatizing, a claim by Elizabeth Van Hoots that relies on Wass. Weaver's comments, as often, suggest aversion to simple political or social ideologies, but also another kind of social homology for historiographical artistry, that of mass uncertainty. Like the embroidery, she says, written sources about the conquest contain narratives riddled with doubt and uncertainty. Grappling with this opaque something must have been a concern of the day. The embroidery acknowledges the limits of human knowledge about the conquest, even as it seeks to remedy them. Trauma, or simply widespread perspectival dissonance? The conquest's reverberations define all the 12th century historical writings Weaver considers, from the phantasmagoric Geoffrey of Monmouth through his vernacular followers. When we reach Weaver's final example, an early 14th century illuminated abridgment of Wass, whose images make readers linger over what Weaver quite brilliantly demonstrates are the most, quote, hermeneutically ticklish moments in Wass's British and Saxon history, I think we've entered a different range of issues, which I would like to understand better. Contemporary clashes with and bigotry against the Welsh, a secular great house whose emerging vernacular literacy included the Anglo-Norman Crusades romances featuring the ultimately baptized Saracen Fierabras, which are also included in the manuscript. Here we seem well beyond the Norman colonial invasion, except as a screen for othering in wider, more international forms. There's no doubt Weaver has shown that all her texts widen as well as challenge historical consciousness, and widen by challenging it. This puts medieval historical writing in a newly primary cultural, theoretical, and psychological position for their and our understanding of the world it addresses. Modern temporality theorists take note. You are more belated than you know.
Thank you all so much for these incredibly generous and generative remarks. I feel suitably humbled by your erudition, and I will try to respond to some of your questions. And I think then afterwards, there's time for you all to have questions. I guess I'll just go in the order in which they were received, although some of them, as you heard, were recurring themes. So Eleanor, you brought up the potential of a lyrical impulse.
Yeah.
And the question of compilation and the question of authorial agency. And compilation and authorial agency attracted the attention of your co-panelists as well. So that's clearly something to be addressed. But I'll start with the lyric. I find that a really interesting question because prior to this book, when interpolation has been worked over in scholarship as something other than harmful, it's often in the context of lyric interpolations where there are inserted lyrics in otherwise prose narratives. And I guess what I'm taking from your question is you're wondering if the things that get inserted sort of get belyricked, as it were, but just because of being inserted or because of the way the manuscripts call attention to them in some cases. Is this an accurate summary?
That's
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess for me, I found that question actually really surprising. I have to say, I have not, I have not thought about it that way. Because I think a lot of times the things that get inserted are just as dusty as the history that's around them. It's just as sort of artistically unpretentious, even though I think that there are often really beautiful moments, even in these drier historical texts. Whereas I think of lyric as sort of highly literary, I think these things are often questionably literary. And so I guess you seem to be asking if there's such a thing as being lyric by position. And I fear I don't know what I think about that. I think my instinct is to say no, I guess. And I think it's because of the level of interest in aesthetic effect that I'm not totally sure that is. I don't think that's a major component of what's going on in these manuscripts. Even though, as you saw with the prophecy manuscripts, sometimes the page layouts are very considered and beautiful. That's kind of the exception rather than the rule. And even in that case, I feel like it's the visual rhetoric of the page rather than the poetics of the prophecies themselves that are really salient. So, but the question of lyric by position, I'm going to continue to ponder that because I haven't thought about that before. On the other hand, the other two questions that are kind of dominant here are things that I had to think about really quite intensely as I drafted this book. So the question of compilation versus interpolation. For non-specialists, compilation is the bringing together of various materials into a work, whether it's an encyclopedia that is kind of a work in and of itself, or whether it's a volume that might contain various works by various authors that are put next to each other. Whereas interpolation is, as I mentioned, the insertion of material into a pre-existing text. And I think ultimately for me that I find that insertion to be a really important feature. Of course, interpolation can still be somewhat haphazard. Someone could just stick a leaf into a book. I can do it right now. I can make an interpolation into my book by putting these papers in. But the ones that I'm thinking about find space in the text for where they might fit in. They look for the gaps and they fill those gaps, or they propose a potential way to fill those gaps. They propose substitutions. Whereas compilation often has really productive juxtapositions and might encourage some of the same sort of mental work of comparing versions of events. But I think it's just ultimately, no matter, even though there are exceptions that maybe prove the rule, I think that ultimately compilation has the possibility of being much more haphazard than most interpolations, because it can be dictated by the size of the parchment. Like, we have more that's the right size to go into this book. There are compilations that are super deeply considered, and every choice is just as robustly thought out as what I'm talking about. But I think that ultimately the sort of, as Andy mentioned, the sort of train car nature, I'm thinking of like the Brio set that's in my house, of these detachable texts that can circulate more freely. That strikes me as a meaningful difference from the interpolated text that I consider. However, I know that a lot of, I think a lot of people would disagree with me and find compilation very generative and meaningful. And indeed, some compilations are also can also be interpolated, right? So they're not mutually exclusive. I'm thinking of the Histoire ancienne, which is a universal history. That's this insane compilation of historical materials. And in one manuscript of that, then a translation of this history of Britain is interpolated into what is already sort of a bonkers compilation. Yeah, so for me, I guess I find interpolation to be more consistently deliberate, which is not the same as saying always more interesting, but more consistently deliberate. And as for the scribe versus author, you all caught me. Where is the authorial agency? I was very wary of pinning that down in this book, actually, and sort of deliberately left it open-ended and allowed a range of people to be the potential agent at any given moment. In part, I did this because of a lack of historical evidence. Often we do not know who the interpolator was. We do not know if it was a rogue scribe. Rogue is kind of a word from the pejorative discourse around interpolation, but we do not know if it was just an individual acting alone. We do not know if it was a patron who requested this, who wanted more information about such and such. We do not know if it was carefully planned or if it was, again, something that was done on the spur of the moment, in terms of how it would be inserted into the text. Like, would it be copied on a separate quire and then brought in? There are a lot of different permutations. And so and then for one of my chapters, I'm talking a lot about reader response, actually, and we don't actually have any record of those responses. And so it's me sort of imagining how a reader might respond to these contradictions and things that are brought up by the Bayeux Embroidery and the heavily illustrated Brut manuscript that I showed. So I tried to sidestep this question in favor of allowing the imagination of various of these figures to be the ones who felt most apt to my readers, actually, to allow you to exercise your readerly prudence and decide who felt like the most likely candidate. So there's just as one concrete example where it's probably has to do with patronage. There's a manuscript where a brief mention of a sort of random Edward that no one cares about is replaced. Is Edward the Elder? Who cares? Is replaced by a very, very long saint's life of Edward the Confessor, whom we all care about. I know deeply. So in that manuscript, it seems like other scholars have done this work. This is not my work. Other scholars have shown that interest in Edward the Confessor, combined with some other interpolated moments in this manuscript, probably show that this manuscript was made for someone, or this version of the text was made for someone in the ambit of Eleanor of Castile, who had links to all of these figures. And so in that case, it's probably someone who's trying to either predict or respond to the explicit desires of the patron. But again, did someone in her circle or she herself say, hey, put more about Gourmand de Nisembach. Hey, I need a little bit extra on Edward the Confessor. Or were they just trying to please her and it was actually a scribe? This is the sort of like uncertainty that I feel like we just don't have enough evidence to ever resolve. And so I preferred to be a little bit loose with who I thought the agent was, because often it's not knowable. It's beyond the limits of what the archive can tell us. Thank you. I think those were the main panelist questions. Although I've avoided the Welsh, I fear, Andy.
The cameo.
Cameo from the Welsh.
Great, we can open up to questions from the audience.
Just add to that last exchange. You went from the audience, so I shouldn't do this.
Go ahead, Andy, while people are thinking, yes. Yes.
Thank you for gracefully.
Yeah.
I should keep on that. But just on the compilation versus interpolation, I think what you.
Oh, you're like-
Oh.
The audience.
Right, so
Zoom,
thank you.
yeah.
Not my interruption can at least be broadcast. So just on the compilation versus interpolation, I mean, I think what you've done is amazingly great because instead of, what happens with compilation is that a certain amount of scholarly attention has noticed, and I think hasn't just created, that there really is a thing, there really is a discourse happening about that emerges sometime in the early 13th century and really builds up. And in Vincent of Beauvais, it just goes, shall I say, viral. It becomes very prolific, and in fact, a lot of it is in fact historical, but not all of it, as you noted. And so that attention you've actually kind of matched with what you're saying about interpolation, which nobody has sort of carried to that point of thinking about it as something they thought about. And you're showing the amount of thought, the variety of that thought. And so in a sense, you don't have to feel like you're competing with compilation. You've actually done something to sort of raise interpolation to a similar focus of attention, and for us to realize the amount of thought in the textual agents of the period doing these things. So and that's quite original. So bravo. Sorry.
Great. You mentioned earlier in your introduction, the chrétien de toi, where it starts with mais, it almost read to me like a volta, like a turn in the text where we have the authorial voice. Is that a moment in your reading where you've seen this repeated introduction of the interpolation, where there's almost a turn, where the author brings something in? Oh, we say author, scribe, author,
The interpolator,
the rogue.
the rogue.
Did it read to you as a way in which you can gesture to authorial attempt? And is a volt a good sort of comparison?
I find that a very beautiful comparison. It's bringing us right back to the question of lyric by placement. So that's wonderful. I'm so glad that you brought that up, Zachary, right? I'm so glad that you brought that up because actually that gesture where someone steps in and says, hey, this is another source, has in previous work been seen often as disqualifying, that this can't be an interpolation because there's a named source, because the interpolation is always supposed to be shady and not declare itself and be like very subtle. I disagree with that because I can't imagine that you can cite 5 whole books. That just doesn't seem to me to be the definition of citation. And so we need another word for this insertion. And it seems to me that interpolation, which indeed scholars have always casually used as part of it. There's another manuscript of or 2 manuscripts where the prophecies are interpolated that also name their source. And this sort of reversal around the word may happens in another one of these manuscripts as well. May means but. So it's like, I'm not going to tell you about this, but what somebody else has to say, let's hear that now. I think that I do think that that gesture is a similar gesture to what we see in compilations, actually. It's kind of like what you mentioned about Vincent de Beauvais being like, and now the author, quoth the author. I mean, that's my bad translation of his Latin, but it's sort of this sort of a very visible intervention. In Vincent de Beauvais manuscripts, it tends to be rubricated, right? So there will be the different sources rubricated.
Except that he distinctly defines it as actor, not auctor. This is the thing, is that this is a mode that isn't authorship, right?
Oh.
Distinct mode. And what you've
Okay,
done
so
is show another kind of distinction.
In Jean de Vigny, the translation, it says auteur. So he mistranslates that. That's really interesting. Okay,
Yeah.
so I'm more familiar with the French one, clearly. And so anyway, so I do think that there's sort of an openness to that gesture that's more similar to what we might expect from more like the lyric interpolations, where they might say, and there's this related song that I know by so-and-so. So actually, Eleanor was circling right back to this question of how lyric these interpolations are. And your term volta is also bringing that into questions. There is a sort of I think in the one I showed you, there's a sort of the interpolator inhabits the first person perspective that was previously inhabited by our loyal guide, the historian Was, and sort of in that way surreptitiously enters into it because there's no sign that this is someone else. He's just saying, and now Chrétien, what he has to say. In the other case, it says like, I, William, will now tell you about this. So you know it's William and not Was anymore. So I do think there's a certain amount of positioning oneself as someone who is gathering together the relevant authorities to augment and enhance Wass's text that's going on in those passages. Thanks.
Okay, well, I'll ask my question and then Dustin. So I must confess I've only read the article on interpolation as a critical category. So if this is something you answer in the book, apologies, but maybe we'd all like to hear more about it anyway. I'm really impressed by the generalizability that this project seems to have, cultivating connections to not only contemporaneous writing in Arabic and Persian, but even contemporary to now writing in English. And I, of course, have my own examples of that. But given the sort of really admirable, sort of rigorous commitment to the sources that you're thinking with and the sort of amazing knowledge that you have from the archive, I'm also impressed by the specificity of the story you're telling. And the distinctions you're making between interpolation and compilation in medieval British Ireland, for instance. So one question I have is, I have a good sense of the rise of interpolation as you're describing it, but what brings about the decline of this sort of culture of interpolation? I mean, the sort of shift between the sort of theories of temporality that you draw our attention to, and then the practices of writing that adheres in is really fascinating. So like, what brings that to an end?
Thank you for this question. I do talk about this in the book, so now I can talk about it to all of you. So I think that the answer is a question of technology, actually. So even through the early modern period, books were often sold unbound, and so you could get quires and arrange them as you saw fit. So it was still relatively easy to do at least sort of like quire length interpolations if you were so inclined, and you could construct your own volume in theory. How much this happened in practice is beyond my ken. Alan may know, I do not know, but I do know that was technologically feasible at that time. After that, with the rise of print books being sold as books, it became a lot harder to insert something certainly into the text block. Of course, you could potentially always stitch something in, but it became less feasible. And now, in the age of e-readers, it's impossible. You can't insert, like, you can't even put a piece. I can't even do my like silly interpolation with my Kindle. Like, it's not possible. Much less like altering anything that you're reading digitally, unless you're on the back end and one of the owners of that website. That's not really possible. I do think that there is an afterlife of interpolative thinking that continues. I actually think hyperlinks are sort of encouraging the sorts of mental interpolations that I talk about in one of my chapters. I think fan fiction can offer an interpolative mode of thinking I'm going to insert my own part of the story that's missing, but it still travels separately from the like canon work. The fan fiction is in its own realm in a way that's different from medieval manuscripts. On the other hand, I think that the sorts of thinking about time survive not only in 21st century poetry and a lot of queer theory and a lot of contemporary talk about that, but also in the 20th century theorists of time and history that we're all familiar with, like Benjamin and Koselleck and Ricoeur. And I talk about that a little bit in my coda, how some of the like theories that emerge from looking at the medieval manuscripts are completely unwittingly. I don't think any of these people were thinking about medieval interpolation whatsoever, but are reproduced in some of the more explicit theory making that we can read from the last, 100 years.
Hi.
I'm not a medievalist either, but some of my best friends are medievalists. Maybe it's a question about time and narrative. I'm trying to understand whether typology has to be anti-linear.
Mhm.
You know, like I could have a type and I could fast forward to the anti-type, but I could still say on a sort of linear plane
Yeah.
of the narrative
Yeah.
without presuming to go above it or on a different level or something like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so typology, I think, relies on linear thinking,
Yeah.
because otherwise it totally doesn't work. Like, what would that be? Like three-dimensional type? I don't know. It's like three-dimensional chess. I can't do it. But yes, it absolutely relies on linear thinking. But what I think is disruptive, as opposed to sort of like teleological linear thinking that's monodirectional, is that it sort of asks, in order to understand the anti-type or the fulfillment, you have to go back to the precursor or the type to be able to fully understand what has been fulfilled, what has changed, how it's a better outcome. And so there's this sort of like necessary recursion or like back and forth along the line. So I agree with you that it doesn't need to be like hovering over itself necessarily, but it's not just a timeline from past to present. It asks to be fully understood, a type and an anti-type need to be put in conversation with each other, which means you're going back and forth between the two of them.
Yeah, that makes
that-
sense.
did
That's
that help?
helpful. Yeah. So it could, the bidirectionality, but maybe also being able to fast forward or.
Yeah, well, and you
To
can
everyone.
jump everything in
Yeah.
between, in theory, once you know where where the relevant figures are, you could just sort of either mentally or actually by turning the pages in the books, look at them in closer contact and sort of forget about what's in between for the sake of the study of the type and the anti-type. Yeah.
So I am a medievalist. Or I play one on TV. Everybody in this room who's published a book knows that once you've published a book, that's old work, right? That's for the best. But not everybody in this room knows you're on this enormous new project, thinking about Latin translations of vernacular literature, or redactions of vernacular literature. So you've shown one kind of sort of technological point of openness that makes this kind of interpolation possible. That is the very making of the manuscript codex, right? Because you can add quires, you can even tip in leaves. Right? Are you finding anything similar at this other kind of openness, which is the point of translation? Are you finding interpolations happening there?
Yes, I am. Thank you for that generous question. The most fascinating example, so I'll just tell it briefly, is this Latin translation of an 1118 Anglo-Norman text called, which is itself a translation of a Latin text. Let me back up. We're talking about the travels of Saint Brendan, who goes on this sort of mystical voyage around various islands that include the back of a fish where he celebrates Easter, and an island where there are birds, but they're actually fallen angels, and another one where Judas is getting like a break from hell. There's like a pillar covered in a net. We think it's an iceberg, like historically speaking. Anyway, he goes on this fabulous journey. This happens in a Latin text that's from around 800. It's copied and copied and copied. In 1118, an Anglo-Norman cleric called Benedict translates it into French. That text has somewhat limited circulation, but it's translated back into Latin 3 different times. Let me tell you about one of them. One of them is this wild poem, probably by Walter of Chatillon. So for the Latin poetry heads in the audience, probably by Walter of Chatillon. It was Bernard Bischoff who said that. So there's not a clear authorial attribution within the text, but he has his reasons. It's this crazy Goliardic poem in it's metrical Latin, it's rhymed, it's very mannered. He translates Benedict's Anglo-Norman French octosyllabic couplets into this insane Latin poem. But Benedict had eliminated one of the weirdest and like least useful, sorry, my perspective, episodes in Brendan's voyage, where there's this island where there are these 3 choirs singing, and like why, it's unclear. Anyway, so there's this island with 3 choirs, and Benedict was like, this is boring and weird, let me cut it. That may not be what he was thinking, but he cut it. it also, it kind of messes with the narrative in terms of the pattern that's being followed. Anyway, so he gets rid of it. Walter Chesnel says, my fellow like high-flying Latinate people in the papal curia where I am were like, where is the three choirs? We need this. You must bring it back. And so he interpolates from the Latin prose. He basically does a formal translation from Latin prose into this like very hirsute verse, and brings it, basically reintegrates it where it had been excised. In other words, he does a similar dynamic to what I talked about with the prophecies, where Wass eliminates them from Geoffrey and then they get reinterpolated. So he does that in his translation, which is also a sort of formal translation on top of being a linguistic translation. So thank you, Chris. You let me talk about that, which is a fascinating feature of my new work. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for that wonderful talk. I'm just curious whether anachrony or anachronism informs your thinking of interpolation, because I'm thinking of the interpolated text as invoking a certain temporality that might be a clash with the surrounding text. And you did mention non-chronological time, linearity. So I'm just curious whether anachrony or anachronism appeared in your thinking about this.
Yeah, thank you. I had to consider that term, and a lot of the work I'm in conversation with uses that term. I ultimately resist it because I think it has a sort of negating, so timelessness, that there's no time, that it's out of time, that it's away from time. And for me, this is more of a situation where there's too much time, that time is just crowding in. And so I have this term of art timeful, which is like maybe not the most beautiful word we've ever heard, but I think captures more accurately the sort of plenitude and sedimentation that I see happening in my corpus. So for me, it's not necessarily disjuncture and removal, but instead it's conjuncture and fullness. So thank you.
Thanks. Also, having not yet read the book, and I fear it'll take us further afield in translation after Chris's question, but I'm wondering, have you found any really interesting, like either cross-linguistic interpolations or maybe in the same vein as like translations which sort of interpolate? Because for example, I'm thinking of, there's a Spanish work which is a huge compilation of crusade narratives. And then it's talking about Godfrey of Bouillon. And it's like, by the way, you'll never believe what happened to his ancestors. He was turned into a swan. And then it spends like hundreds of pages on like Swan Night narratives, and then goes back to the history. So yeah, I guess like what's the sort of relationship there? I mean, I know that translation sort of elides like where you might interpolate, because you're sort of already sort of piecing together things.
Yeah, so obviously translation can be compilatory, as we can all imagine. It sounds like that's both in it, like that's they're bringing in these other sources, but inserting them, so it'd be more of an interpolation. But I also talk in the book about Lawman as an interpolator of the Brut. He's someone who translated the Brut from French into Middle English. And he added a bunch of episodes, or really radically expanded other episodes. And so even though that's usually just seen as sort of like a translator's choice, like some translators are more prolix and like go on, and others try to, stick closer. For me, that's a sort of interpolation that ends up having some of the same effects that I discern in the rest of my corpus. Also, just mention for the Chaucerians, you all well know that in Troilus and Crusade, Chaucer is not only translating Boccaccio, but also interpolating other sources and translating them as well. So that's another way that a translator might be an interpolator. It's not necessarily from his own creativity, but it is creative, but it's a creativity that involves like translating Petrarch and inserting that in. So it's a little bit more of a more clearly the translator translating various other things and interpolating them versus the translator coming up with some of his own material and interpolating that. Thanks, Grant.
One more.
One more. This may be a little bit of an unfair question, but it's a curiosity, and I'm sorry if it is in the book, but I think maybe not. Chrétien de Troyes, I'm wondering about continuation and interpolation, and Chrétien not only gets inserted into the
Yeah.
group, but of course also doesn't finish the Conte
Yeah.
Graal, and then it becomes this enormous French work.
Yeah.
And so I'm sort of curious about something that might be a sort of interpolation that doesn't have something on the other side.
Yeah, I think for me, that's not an interpolation because the necessary condition is that it's inserted. However, it's related to interpolation, certainly, because they share that they happen in a second time, that they're like belated, that there's something and then something else comes and is added to it. But the thing about continuation that I think is also meaningfully different, not just that it's not inserted, but the consequences of it not being inserted is that it can go on forever. It can go on
Speaking of fan
forever.
fiction.
I know, yeah. So like the 5 romances is bad enough, but like there's kind of like a physical limit to what an interpolation that anyone could assume that you would know how to come back to the story. That seems like there's some kind of limit there. Not so for continuation, which just go and go and go and go. So I think that that's a meaningful distinction as well as some kind of boundedness. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us in person and online. Please join me in once again congratulating Hannah Weaver.